Hello YouTube, it's GMAN 5338, your streetwise professor. Today it's story time. Yeah, we're going to delve into some true crime today. We're going to talk about the Canadian Armed Forces' most prolific sexual predator, James Wilks. Now, before anybody starts freaking out about stolen valor, yes, that's me in the beginning video, okay? But anyways, let's get on to the case of James Wilks. Check it.
We still living when the loving is gone. Kill, kill was a government song. Sing along, it's just my brothers in arms. Gotta stick together, now more than ever it's on.
So thanks for stopping in and checking us out today. What we're going to talk about today is some true crime. We're going to talk about the most prolific sexual predator in the Canadian Armed Forces, James Wilks. Now, in the Canadian Army, I did a bunch of stuff. I was in the Armored Corps, I was infantry, but I was also an MP, or a military cop. And in that capacity, I worked regular uniform patrols, I worked street crimes, I worked narcotics, I worked major crimes. Hell, I was even part of the Ontario Gang Investigators Association. I got to meet a lot of really interesting shit rats. I've talked in earlier shows about a case I had where I had to deal and work with the FBI. I even hired a psychic on that case. I've dealt with child sexual predators, child pornographers. I've investigated sudden deaths. And I stopped a mass shooting in 2008. That's right. We've talked about this one too on my show. The mass shooting that never was. Eric Wheeler. Now, today we're going to talk about James Wilks. This guy, over a period of about 5 or 6 years, amassed quite a list of victims. And so I want to talk about it. I got to take part in the case. I wasn't a lead investigator, but I was an assisting investigator on the case. So I got to interview and interrogate James Wilks. I got to interview witnesses. And I even came out of this with my second of 2 professional standards complaints that I ever received as a police officer. I received one for saying fuck at a call. I was reprimanded for swearing. And I also received one for this case, actually 2. And we'll talk about that as well. So stay tuned. So for the last bit of my career in the Canadian Armed Forces, I was posted to, and I was an investigator with the Canadian Forces National Investigation Service, which is our major crimes unit. We exist outside of the chain of command of the Canadian military, and that's so that we can conduct serious investigations without having the worry, anyways, of potentially being interfered with by the rest of the Canadian military. And the best way I could really describe this or give you something to compare it to is the TV show NCIS. It's kind of a lot like what we did. Our detachment was very small. There were like 6 of us, and we covered all the way up to, the kind of far northern reaches of Ontario, all the way down to the U.S. border, out to, Kingston, Ottawa. And then we also did international cases. We had cases in Germany and other places as well that we dealt with. But yeah, there were 6 of us, and we dealt with all the major cases in that area. And James Wilks happened to be one of those cases. Now, James Wilks' job in the military was a medic. He was in the Navy, and he was a medic. And this is how he was able to sort of carry out his dastardly deeds, and how he was able to be so prolific. Because when you join the military, one of the things you have to do is you have to have a physical examination. Men and women, it's no different. And so towards the end of James's career, he was responsible for conducting these examinations, and he conducted them in Windsor, Ontario, London, Ontario, and Thunder Bay, Ontario. Now, over these 3 different recruiting centers, he would amass a significant number of victims. We're talking 20 to 30 victims. and potentially even more than that. I still think that there are a number of victims out there who just never came forward with their cases. Now, Wilks's MO was pretty insidious. He sort of thought this one through a little bit. I mean, jail's full of smart people, right? And James Wilks is no different, but clearly it worked for him. It was able to allow him to get away with this sort of crap for a significant amount of time as far as I'm concerned. And it's also what allowed him to amass such a number of victims. So what James would do during exams of females, he would conduct fake breast exams. He would conduct exams on the victims that didn't need to be conducted. Really, your breasts have no thing to do with your performance in the military, okay? So there's no reason for the military to be concerned about a female's breasts upon her entrance into the military. But James Wilks here, he took it upon himself to make sure everything was okay with their breasts. And in doing so was committing sexual assault and breach of trust, because he would convince these women that it was part of their exam and that they had to have it done. So between the years of 2003 and 2009, so over 6 years, James was going around to these locations in Windsor, London, and Thunder Bay and conducting these exams on potential recruits and sexually assaulting these women during the examinations. Now, things didn't really come out to us until I believe it was around 2010 when the initial complaint was received. And it would just all snowball from there. We would see a significant increase in the number of victims that would come forward. But unfortunately, we wouldn't find out about them until after really the initial trial. So back in 2011, James Wilks stands trial for a sexual assault and breach of trust charge. And he would go on trial at Wolseley Barracks, which is a Canadian Forces detachment in London, Ontario. My hometown, the 519, ladies and gentlemen. And that's where he would initially stand trial. Now, as a result of this and a result of publications, articles, and news reports, we would get a significant number of claims from other victims, which would bring us to trial number 2. Now, trial number 2 occurs in 2013, in early 2013. And this is where he would see the most amount of complaints against him. He would deal with 16 breach of trust charges and 10 sexual assault charges. Now, again, because of the publications of this trial and the notoriety that James was starting to get, we were receiving even more complaints. It was never ending, it seemed. You know, I was starting to feel really bad for the 2 lead detectives on the case, because no matter how much digging they did, it just seemed like it was never ending. Like the sort of list of victims and the story here was just never ending. Like it was bottomless. And again, so out of this trial in 2013, we get more victims. Now, as I said, James would be tried twice at Wolseley Barracks in London, Ontario. And he would also be tried once in Gatineau, Quebec. And this would be his third and final trial. Now, again, like I said, I believe that there are more victims out there. I believe that there are more women that didn't come forward because either A, they had moved on from it, or B, they just didn't want to have to expose themselves to the trauma again. The investigations of sexual assaults, it's very difficult and it's very hard on the victims, which is a reason why a lot of times victims don't come forward, which is a shame. I think that I don't want to be victim blaming here, but it's really unfortunate that he put these victims in a position where they didn't want to come forward, because it would have been nice to have to be able to get our hands on this guy a lot sooner, so that we wouldn't have had all these victims. Now, like I said, the victims were all young women that were potential recruits for the Canadian Armed Forces. And there is a publication ban on the victims' names and stuff, so I can't really get into too much detail about the victims. But what I can tell you is that James Wilks, his actions led a number of these women to not pursue careers in the Canadian Armed Forces, which is a shame because, we potentially lost ourselves a significant number of what could have been really good soldiers, sailors, and air personnel, all because of this guy and his grubby hands. And of course, the victims didn't just settle with justice out of the court system, okay, or out of the military court system. They also dealt with Mr. Wilks and the Canadian Armed Forces through civil matters, through civil court matters. And those have, I believe, all been settled as well. So James Wilks, like I said, he goes through 3 trials. He has 2 trials in London and he has 1 in Gatineau. And out of those trials, the very first one, he's sentenced to 9 months. The second trial, he receives 30 months. And the third and final trial brings him another 9 months. James Wilks ends up serving 48 months in probably what is one of the most cutthroat detention centers in Canada, at the Elgin Middlesex Detention Center, or EMDC, in London, Ontario. And now this is where I met James Wilks. This is where I got to interrogate the guy. Now, the problem with EMDC is that it's overcrowded, and the design of the building really doesn't allow for the COs to be able to keep proper eyes on people. And I know that when I went to go interrogate James Wilks, that out of some sense of sweet justice, that I know he was having a rough time in there. I could tell. When you see somebody who's just kind of beaten down and scared, that was James Wilks. And I gotta say that there is a side of me that was very happy to see that. Now, he's not much of a man to physically look at. He's short. He's very plump, you could say. He's rather big-boned. And it looked like he had been growing out his fingernails in an attempt to be able to protect himself, because nobody likes sexual predators in jail. I know a number of guys who were COs for James while he was serving his time, and it didn't sound like he had an easy go of things. So, that's a bit of justice right there. So out of this whole escapade, we're looking at dozens and dozens of victims. James Wilks does 48 months, which, as far as I'm concerned, isn't a whole lot for what he did. I'm not one to sort of over punish people. I don't necessarily agree with how Americans sort of run their justice system and their penal system. But I feel that 2 years was not enough for James Wilks. I really don't think he learned his lesson. In all of his trials, he pleaded not guilty. This guy was not conscious of the fact of what he was doing. And I believe that he would still pose a danger to society after his release. And I think that he perhaps should have spent a little more time behind bars. Now, aside from what happened to James Wilks, I was investigated as a result of my participation in this investigation. There was a potential victim who came forward, and so we investigated. I assisted in the interview of this potential victim / potential witness, and things weren't really adding up in this witness's statements. They didn't fit the sort of typical description of what Wilks was going for. They hadn't really described anything of a sexual nature that had transpired. And so there was no cause, no reason for us to lay a charge in this particular matter. And the victim wasn't quite happy about that, or the alleged victim, I should say, wasn't too happy with that. So 8 years later, 8 years after this has gone on, this alleged victim decides to come forward and file a complaint about us not laying charges in the case. And I was named, my partner was named, he was the lead investigator on the case, as was another lead investigator. So 8 years after the case transpires, I'm under investigation. I've been retired now for like 5 years, and now I'm under investigation for something I did 8 years ago. I don't get it, but the military let it happen. Anyways, Christmas of last year, I received word that the investigation had concluded, that, I was found to not have done anything wrong. Well, it doesn't end here, because the victim isn't satisfied with that. So they appealed the initial investigation against me, my partner, and the other detective. And it's still ongoing. I'm still dealing with this shit as of today. I have not received notice of being cleared in this investigation. So it's something that still is lingering over me. Now, lastly, as a result of the Wilks case and a number of other rather serious sexual offenses that occurred in the Canadian Armed Forces. I mean, we had, there was an Air Force officer out in Trenton, Ontario, who was arrested around the time of James Wilks' trials for being a serial killer, for sexual related killings. So, we've seen this ongoing in the military. It's been, in the 90s is when the whole sort of lid got blown off all the sexual assaults ongoing in the Canadian military. And just recently, the Canadian military issued this apology to all of the victims of sexual assault who served in the forces. So that's it. That's the story of James Wilks, the most prolific sexual predator that the Canadian Armed Forces has ever produced. Next week, we're dropping some more shows. We got Mental Health Minutes. We got Story Time. I'm probably going to drop another Rabbit Hole music video. So stay tuned for all that. I promise, though, the music video won't be country. I know not a lot of people dig country, but for me, I really love it. I think maybe next week we'll look at some hip-hop or some punk or something like that. Something a little different from country music, okay? We'll try to get it a little more upbeat. But anyways, listen, until then, I want you all to stay up, stay strong, and look out for each other, people, because we're all we got. Peace.
Yo, this one's going out there to all my homies, my natives, my brothers, my family that's supporting me. Those that are overseas, those that are on lockdown, and those that are free.
Gordo. We still living when the loving is gone. Kill, kill was a government song. Sing along, it's just my brothers in arms. Gotta stick together, now more